From Babylon to Timbuktu, Chapter 1, Ancient Black Civilizations. More than 6,000 years ago in the land called Mesopotamia, there developed the most remarkable civilization then known to mankind. This civilization was centered between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. These rivers begin in the mountains of Armenia and flow in a southeastern direction toward the Persian Gulf. The soil of this area is tremendously fertile because of the alluvial deposits brought down by the two rivers. European civilization developed from ancient black civilization. Without this black civilization, white domination and influence as we know it today would have been improbable. A number of different tribes were entrenched in the southern part of the Tigris-Euphrates region. This southern section was known at different times by many names, among which are Sumer, Akkad, and Chaldee. But the name best known to us is Babylonia. This area was also the location of the Garden of Eden, and the people of this region were jet black. I shall prove conclusively that the black people have the most ancient history of all humans. The best available source of proof is the history of the Jews, known as the Bible. In Genesis 2:10 it is written, "And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. There were 4 rivers which watered the Garden of Eden. I shall cite the 3rd and 4th rivers first, then I shall proceed to the 1st and 2nd rivers, because it fits better into my line of reasoning." Genesis 2:14 reads, "And the name of the 3rd river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the 4th river is Euphrates." Commentators and scholars have identified the river Hiddekel. They say it is the Tigris River. Now I shall cite Genesis 2:13. "And the name of the 2nd river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia." Because the Garden of Eden is associated with the land of Ethiopia, we can conclude that the people were black. Rashi, the 11th century commentator on the Bible, said that the Gihon is the Nile River that bows through eastern Africa. Rashi most likely makes this point because the Nile flows in Ethiopia and into Egypt. Dr. Spieser, who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, said, "There is no basis for the detouring of the Gihon to Ethiopia." He meant the Ethiopia in Africa, not to mention the Pishon in various remote regions of the world. I agree with Dr. Spieser that we should not search for the Gihon in Africa, nor the Pishon in a remote area of the earth, but that we should search for the Pishon and the Gihon in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. There were 2 Ethiopian nations in ancient times, Eastern Ethiopia and Western Ethiopia. This point Dr. Spieser failed to elucidate, possibly because of an oversight. There was an Ethiopian civilization in southern Mesopotamia, or Babylon, but the people in this region did not use their tribal name Ethiopia to designate their nationality. They called themselves by the name of the cities that they constructed and inhabited, or they called themselves by an event that happened there. For example, God confused the language of the people at the Tower of Babel. Babel means confusion in Hebrew. This is why the Ethiopian tribes called themselves Babylonians, referring to the name of the city that they constructed. There are many nations that are not designated by their true nationality. For example, the white Australians came from England, but those Englishmen who live in Australia do not call themselves by their ancestral name. They call themselves by the name of the country which they colonized, which is Australia. The people of Australia are represented in the United Nations by the name of their nation, Australia, and not under their ancestral name, England. The people who resided in the lower part of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley were Ethiopian, black in complexion. We read in Genesis 10:8 that Cush begat Nimrod. The word Cush means Ethiopia, and Cush was the father of the Ethiopians. For the meaning of the word Cush, see Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary. Nimrod was a mighty Ethiopian conqueror and builder in the land of Shinar. We find in Genesis 10:8-10 that Nimrod ruled over such cities as Babylon, Erech, Akkad. All of these cities are situated in the land of Shinar. Another name for Shinar is Sumer. This civilization was of a high order and one of the oldest civilizations in ancient times. In Genesis 10:7 we read, "And the sons of Cush, Seba and Havilah." Now we have learned that Havilah was the son of Cush, who was an Ethiopian. The word Havilah becomes the name of a tribe and a region, known as the land of Havilah, and the Havilites or Ethiopians lived in the land of Havilah. Moreover, scholars have located this land near the Persian Gulf. In search of the land of Havilah, we find that there was another Havilah who was one of the sons of Joktan. Read Genesis 10:26-29. But this Havilah was in the line of Shem. Read Genesis 10:22. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The children of Shem are called Shemites. The sons of Ham are called Hamites, and the son of Japheth are called Japhites. We should not confuse Havilah, the son of Joktan, with Havilah, the son of Cush. Now it is logical to conclude that Havilah, the son of Cush, is intended in Genesis 2:11 to be the Havilah of the land of Havilah. Because that Havilah was a Cushite, Ethiopian, his habitation would naturally be adjacent to his brother Nimrod, who ruled Babylon. Abraham was one of the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, and Abraham's father, Terah, came from the land of Ur in the Chaldees, Genesis 11:26-28. The land of Ur in the Chaldees was located at the southern part of the Euphrates. The Chaldeans were one of the many Cushite tribes. Cush means black according to the Bible dictionary. This dictionary defines further Cush, the name of a son of Ham, apparently the eldest, and of a territory or territories occupied by his descendants. The Cushites appear to have spread along tracts extending from the higher Nile to the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. History affords many connections between Babylon, Arabia, and Ethiopia. There is more than adequate evidence that the ancient nations of Babylon, Acadia, Sumer, and the Chaldee were inhabited by the Cushite tribes, or Ethiopians, on all sides of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Pishon and the Gihon rivers mentioned in Genesis 2:11-13 wind in turn through the land of Havilah, somewhere near the Persian Gulf. Although it is difficult to identify these two rivers exactly, most likely the center of the Garden of Eden was in the lower part of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. This was the most fertile region in the Middle East, with its many canals and lakes. No wonder it was called the Garden of Eden. It was so well watered that the vegetation looked better than an English park. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers join before they reach the Persian Gulf. Then they separate again, making 4 rivers of the channels of these 2 rivers. This is one of the theories of the top-rated authorities. The modern names of the rivers that flow into the Tigris and Euphrates are the Great Zab, south of Nineveh, the Little Zab, south of the Great Zab. The Diyala River flows into the Tigris at Baghdad, Iraq. Sumer and Kish. Before the dispersal of mankind at the Tower of Babel, this region was not called Babylon. It was only after the confusion of the language and the dispersal of the people that the name Babel was given to the tower. This conclusion is reached by way of logic. What was the name of this region and tower before the confusion of the language and the dispersal? Webster's dictionary, Gazetteer section, says Sumer is in the southern division of ancient Babylon. Moreover, this same dictionary says on page 849, Sumerian, the pre-Semitic population of the lower Euphrates Valley. The pre-Semitic population means that the black Sumerians were there first. This point is in harmony with my original position that the people in Lower Mesopotamian were Eastern Ethiopians. These Sumerians or Ethiopians and their kindred appear to have settled along tracts from Mesopotamia to India. This area now includes southern Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwest India. The first and second allusions to Sumer in the Bible are in Genesis 10:10, 11:1 under the name Shinar. Webster's dictionary, Gazetteer section, hints to this relationship of Shinar and Sumer. There is definitely a blood relationship between the Dravidian tribes of India and the Ethiopian Sumerians. The Sumerian civilization preceded the Babylonian. The Sumerians founded cities that existed more than 4,000 years BC, such as Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and Ur. Archaeologists have found skeletons of ancient Dravidian and Netta types in Ur and Kish. Antiquated Sumerian statuettes resemble the statuettes of the Dravidian civilization. Chapter 2: The Origin of the White Race. After the destruction of mankind by the flood, Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives were the only people that were saved. The sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From these 3 sons of Noah was the whole earth populated. The ark rested on Mount Ararat. Mount Ararat was located in the land of Armenia. The words Armenia and Ararat mean high ground. The entire earth at this time was of one speech and one language. Most of the people dwelled in the plain of Shinar, in Hebrew, the valley of Shinar. Men began to congregate in this territory and to build a tower up to heaven. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus says, God also commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth, but the people did not obey God. Now, when man was in the process of building the tower, God disapproved of its construction because it showed a disbelief in His word. The divine had promised Noah that he would not destroy the earth by water again. Nimrod the Ethiopian was the leader of the conspiracy against God. He was a mighty man and a conqueror. He held the people under his dictatorship. When God considered what had been done, He confused men's language and scattered them toward the four directions of the earth. The sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Because the world was populated from these three sons of Noah, it is proper to classify men only according to this classification: Shemites, Hamites, and Japhites, and not Caucasoid, Mongoloid, or Negroid. The latter category is a modern anthropological classification that we will deal with more thoroughly later. The parts of the earth inhabited by the children of Shem were parts of the territory of Assyria and Elam, Persia, east of the Tigris River, the eastern part of Syria, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. All the children of Shem were black. This position will be supported by arguments and facts later. The second classification of mankind was the Hamites, who controlled the great centers of civilization in ancient time, 4000 BC, soon after the flood. This civilization included the continent of Africa, the land of Canaan, Israel, and parts of Arabia, Syria, Phoenicia, Turkey, Babylonia, southern Persia, Iran, East Pakistan, and a large part of India. The third classification of mankind was the Japhites from Japheth, who was the youngest son of Noah. The offspring of Japheth occupied the Isle of Gentiles, the shore territories of the Mediterranean Sea in Europe and parts of Asia Minor, whence they dispersed northward over the entire continent of Europe and a great part of Asia. After Noah's Ark rested on the mountain of Ararat and the dispersal of the children of men at the Tower of Babel, Japheth's descendants traveled west, north, and northeast of the mountains of Ararat and the Caucasus Mountains. The Japhites settled near the mountains Taurus and Amanus in Turkey. They journeyed toward the river Tanais in southeast Russia and along Europe to Cadiz, Spain. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Javan, Tubal, Meshesh, and Tiras, Gene 10:2. Gomer was the ancestor of the first Sumerians and of the later Cimbri, including other offshoots of the Celtic family and of the present-day Gaels of Ireland, Scotland, and the Hebrides Islands. These Sumerians were described by Homer the Greek as dwelling in a remote place of mist and gloom. This place was located north of the Black Sea. The second son of Japheth was Magog, the father of the Magogites. Flavius Josephus said that the Greeks called these people Scythians. The Scythians included all the wandering tribes who dealt mostly near the north of the Black and Caspian Seas. They were regarded by the ancients as tremendously lacking in intelligence and civilization. The third son of Japheth was Madai, the father of the Medes. They were located on the southern part of the Caspian Sea, and they later united with the Persians to form one race. From Javan, the fourth son of Japheth, came the Ionians and all the Greeks. Tubal, the fifth son of Japheth, is associated with Javan, Isaiah 66:19, Meshesh, and Tubal, Ezekiel 32:26, and 39:1, are nations of the north of the focal point of the land of Israel. Josephus identified the descendants of Tubal with the early Iberians, Iberis. They were the inhabitants of the territory between the Caspian and Euxine Seas, which is Georgia in southern Russia. The last son of Japheth was Tiras, the father or ancestors of the Thracians. This land, Thrace, was situated north of Turkey, Asia Minor, and northeast of Greece. Japheth's grandson Ashkenaz formed the Germanic race. In the Hebrew language, the word means German. By 378 AD, the Germanic tribes were on the move. They were known under these names: Lombards, Burgundians, Franks, Saxons, Angles, Jutes, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Sueves, and Vandals. These 10 Germanic barbarian tribes settled all over Western Europe and intermingled with the modern nations of Western Europe as we know them today. All these tribes were the descendants of Japheth. The ancient people did not classify races according to skin color like the modern nations of Europe and America. The ancients, including the Greeks and Romans, identified people according to their national or tribal names. They used such names as Visigoths, Vandals, Saxons, Ethiopians, Carthaginians, Jews, Arabs, Persians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and Moors. They did not use the term Negro, which is a modern term, to refer to the black races, or the word Caucasian to refer to the white races. Dividing the world along a color line was an idea that originated with the white supremacists in Europe after the Renaissance. The Europeans did not have any great civilization immediately after the fall of Greece and Rome. During the Middle Ages, the black nations of Africa and Asia had the greatest political, economical, educational, and military influence in the world. At this time, Europe existed in a state of darkness for 1,000 years. In the 17th century and later, Europe began to emerge out of the slough of ignorance, and certain Germans and others conceived of themselves as belonging to a superior race. Johann F. Blumenbach, a German, 1752 to 1840, was the first to divide humanity on the basis of skin color. Up to this time, no such attempts had been made. His classification set up a color line to the detriment of later generations. Mr. Blumenbach classified 5 chief races of mankind: the Caucasian, the Mongolian, the Ethiopian, the American or American Indians, and Malayan. Moreover, he considered the Caucasian to be the original race. Blumenbach, the anthropologist, named the whites after the Caucasus Mountains. These mountains are situated between the Black and Caspian Seas because he thought the purest white people originated there. Blumenbach was a racist, and so was J.A. Gobineau. A third man by the name of H.S. Chamberlain wanted to advance the supremacy of the white Nordic race and its culture. These men attributed psychological value and importance to race. This was racism, and it led to a horrible, vicious racial philosophy and to the persecution of the Jews in Nazi Germany. T.R. Garth wrote in his book Race Psychology, 1931, "Any disposition on our part to withhold from some race the right to a free and full development must be taken as an indication of rationalization on the account of race prejudice, and such an attitude is inexcusable in an intelligent populace." As I have proven, the earliest civilizations began in North Africa and the Middle East among the black races. Read about the black Asiatics in Herb Wentz's It Began in Babel, a book on the origin of races, pages 125 to 129 and page 368. We have more than adequate proof that the white races began near the Caucasus Mountains, and from there they spread north, northwest, and northeast into Europe and Asiatic Russia. Now, we know that the Japhites, Europeans, are white today. Were they originally white, beginning with their ancestor Japheth, or did a change materialize in the skin color of the descendants of Japheth? This question is difficult to answer. I was told that Japheth was a black man, but he wanted to be white, so God changed him to a white man. Evidence to that theory is lacking. Nevertheless, scientists and anthropologists have found different kinds of mutations in certain parts of the world. A physical mutation is a sudden variation or change, the offspring differing from its parents in some outstanding characteristic, also a major change in the chromosomes or genes that determine heredity. Blonde hair among the black Australian Aborigines is an example of a mutation, and probably albinos are a good example of mutations with their white skin, woolly hair, thick lips, and Ethiopian noses. Any sudden change from the normal is regarded as a mutation. Other examples of mutation are blondism or whiteness among monkeys, apes, and chimpanzees. Major mutations or changes took place among the descendants of Japheth. This is obvious because of their white skin. In other words, they were black at one time, but their skin changed to white. This phenomenon can be understood in view of the total world population. Over 2/3 of the population of the world consists of colored people. That is a ratio of 2 to 1. 2 out of Noah's 3 sons remained black. We know this to be true because many of the people throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the islands of the Pacific Ocean are yellow, brown, or black. They have facial features like the Congoid Africans, especially the Vietnamese, Filipino, the people of India, they are a mixture of Black Dravidians and Indo-Europeans, Thailanders, Burmese, Indonesians, Guineans, Sumatrans, and the Aborigines of Australia, etc. You can get a good example of the features of these people by reading geographical magazines and observing the foreign students who come from these countries. There was also an Indo-European invasion, Germanic, of the Middle East between the years 2000 and 1500 BC. These Germanic tribes intermingled with the black people everywhere they traveled. This mingling made the people in Syria, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, India, and parts of Arabia much lighter in complexion. Now, the color of the people in this region ranges from brown to yellow. The Greek and Roman invasions also made these people in the Middle East lighter. Another fact we should not forget is that the Moors and Arabs from North Africa captured and raped European women. As a result, the North Africans became lighter. At one time, these people in North Africa and the Middle East were all black. Whites have intermingled their blood with blacks in Asia, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. In spite of this, the colored people of the world control about 3/4 of the Earth's geographical area. Because the colored people of the world are in a majority, it is proper to infer that whites have always been a minority and that the black people are the original people of humanity. It is interesting and meaningful to learn that the Japhites, Europeans, traveled northwest, north, and northeast of the mountainous region of the Caucasus into Europe. It gives me the impression that the Japhites were isolated, or that they isolated themselves from the civilization and domination of Nimrod, which began the land of Mesopotamia. When the Japhites separated at the Tower of Babel, the theory and probability is that they turned white. There are many cases of individuals turning white in Jewish biblical history. When God wanted to show Moses a miracle, he turned his hand white as snow, then he turned it back. From Babylon to Timbuktu again its original color, black. In ancient Israel, when a man had a white spot in his skin, or white or yellow hair, or white skin somewhat reddish, he was pronounced unclean. All people who were victims of this shameful disease were isolated outside of the camp or city. Those that had leprosy were called lepers, and they had to shout, "Unclean! Unclean!" All people in the ancient world who had yellow hair and leprosy were despised and segregated. This is one reason the white supremacists discriminate against the black people today. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses and defamed his character because he married an Ethiopian woman. As a punishment, God struck Miriam with leprosy and she turned white as snow. Now, many people have deceived themselves in thinking that Miriam and Aaron spoke against her because she was a black woman, but this is not the case, because Miriam, Aaron, and Moses were all black people. They spoke against Moses because the Ethiopian woman was of a different religion. The color issue did not exist in their day. To prove this point, the Israelites dwelt among the Hamites, Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They intermarried. All the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baalim, the idol god. Because they served the idol Baalim, the God of Israel became angry and sold them into slavery. It was the worshipping of the idols, not the marriages, that God disapproved. Marriages were forbidden because God feared that the alien races would persuade the Israelites to worship their idols, but in Moses' case, he had converted the Ethiopian woman to his religion. Miriam and Aaron used the Ethiopian woman as an excuse to challenge Moses' authority. It was a family dispute of jealousy among the three of them. Moreover, Miriam and Aaron were older than Moses. They said, "Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us?" And the Lord heard it. In another case of leprosy, God showed Moses some miracles to display to the children of Israel, that they would believe that Moses was sent by God. In these cases, Moses' hand turned white. Naaman and Gehazi had leprosy. I will write a summary of this story. Naaman was the captain of the Syrian army. He acquired leprosy, boils and whitening of the skin. He wanted to be cured. Then he heard about Elisha the prophet. Elisha told him to dip 7 times in the Jordan River. Naaman obeyed and he was cured. A reward was offered Elisha, but he refused it. A servant of Elisha named Gehazi wanted the reward that his master Elisha refused. Then Gehazi ran to look for Naaman. When he found him, he asked for the reward and said that his master had sent him. This, of course, was a lie. When Gehazi returned to Elisha, Elisha said, "I know you have gotten garments, olive yards, and all kinds of wealth by means of subterfuge. Therefore, the leprosy that Naaman had will cleave unto you and unto your seed, descendants, forever." And he departed from his presence a leper as white as snow. This type of leprosy affected the reproductive organs, genes, and chromosomes that determine hereditary characteristics in his body. This meant all his children would produce white offspring, even though he was a black man at first. This was the curse of Gehazi. Chapter 3. Afro Asian culture goes to Europe. The Sumerians, Babylonians, and Ethiopians were black people. They contributed much to the advancement of civilization. Because they studied astrology, they were capable of formulating many principles of astronomy. These black people were so sagacious and skillful that they were able to divide the years into months, weeks, hours, minutes, and seconds. In mathematics, they developed the decimal system. The most famous of the Babylonian kings was Hammurabi, who ruled about 2150 BC. He was outstanding for his codification of a system of laws founded on retaliation as the punitive measure for crime. He also established a 7-day week, with the last day a rest day or Sabbath. The idea was adopted by the Hebrews and then transmitted to the Greeks, Romans, and other Europeans. The literature of the Babylonians is quite interesting. Long ago, these black people wrote with a sharp instrument on clay tablets. Thousands of these tablets have been found, and some of them disclose a popular work known as the Enuma Elish, or the Creation Epic. The story of how the world began derived from the Babylonians. After the dispersal of mankind at the Tower of Babel, the Black Hamites migrated toward the east, south, southwest, and the west. These Black Hamites settled in the land of Canaan. Later on, it was called Israel. The land of Canaan gets its name from the youngest son of Ham, who was Canaan. The Canaanites were the primordial aborigines of the land of Canaan. We may call them Africans because of their blood relationship to the other inhabitants of the African continent. There were 11 Canaanite tribes living in the land of Canaan and surrounding it before the black Israelites possessed it. The greatest cultural and commercial cities of these black Canaanites were Tyre and Sidon, sometimes written Zidon. This city gets its name from Sidon, the firstborn son of Canaan. The Sidonians and the Tyrians were of the same race, and their kings ruled over both of these cities. In many history books you will read about the Sidonians under the name Phoenicia. The Greeks called the Sidonians Phoenicians, land of palm, because they found many palm trees there, but the Sidonians called their nation by the name of Canaan. Phoenicia, or the land of the Sidonians, was located to the north of Palestine, along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, bounded by that sea on the west and by the mountain ranges of Lebanon on the east. Tyre and Sidon were founded about 2300 BC. The Tel El Amarna tablets show that Tyre was a place of great strength in the 15th century BC. Sidon was still older. For a long time, it was the only black Phoenician city known to the Greeks. Even after Tyre took the leadership, the Greeks and Hebrews spoke of the Phoenicians as Sidonians, and King Ethbal of Tyre is called King of the Zidonians. These black people were proficient in philosophy, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and navigation. They had good harbors, which enabled them to navigate to distant lands such as Cyprus, Sardinia, Crete, Rhodes, Cadiz in Spain, Sicily, Carthage in North Africa near Tunis, Tangier, Ophir, and the Canary Isles. These Phoenicians were skilled also in metalwork, needlework, and embroidery. They extracted dye from the shellfish abounding in the adjacent waters. This dye became known later as Tyrian purple. They made glass from the white sand of the Mediterranean coast. The Phoenicians spoke a Hamitic, Semitic language so closely allied to the Hebrew that Phoenician and Hebrew, though different dialects, may practically be regarded as the same language. It was previously stated that there were 11 Canaanite tribes: Sidonians, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgasites, Hivites, Arkites, Sinites, Avradites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. Hebrew has its origin in the Canaanite language. When Abraham came from the region of Babylon into the land of Canaan, he found the Canaanite language similar to his own language. Abraham communicated very well with the inhabitants of the new land, adopted the Canaanite language, made certain modifications, and it became known as Hebrew. The Hebrew language was very similar to the Canaanite, says the Bible dictionary. Phoenician or Canaanite can be classified as an African language because the Canaanites were blood brothers of the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Nubians, Sudanese, and other Africans. The Phoenicians established a colony in North Africa called Carthage, and they, the Carthaginians, always considered themselves Canaanites. When Moses led the black Israelites out of Egypt, northeastern Africa, Moses died in the wilderness. Then Joshua led the Israelites into the land of Canaan and disposed the Canaanites. Now it is written in a Jewish book called the Babylonian Talmud. For when the Africans came to plead against the Jews before Alexander of Macedon, they said that Canaan belonged to us, as it is written, the land of Canaan with the coast thereof, and Canaan was the ancestor of these people, ourselves. These Canaanites or Africans were driven out of the land of Canaan by Joshua. About 332 BC, Alexander conquered Palestine. As stated above, the Africans came to Alexander claiming that the land of Canaan belonged to them. The point I want to elucidate is that these Canaanites considered themselves Africans. Consequently, we can correctly say that the Hebrew Canaanite language is one of the African languages. Many of the private houses of these black people were equipped with cisterns for storing water. The wealth of Phoenicia, or Carthage, was predicated on clandestine technological procedures in manufacture, secret mines of advantageous and expensive metals, concealed secret trading posts in the remote areas from Ethiopia to the Pillars of Hercules. Their knowledge of navigation enabled them to reach the British Isles and the Arctic Ocean. The English alphabet derived from two ancient black nations, the Phoenician Canaanite alphabet and the Hebrew. The Phoenicians had a powerful navy. They were a great trading people. When the Phoenicians traded with the Greeks did not have an alphabet. As a result, they adopted the Phoenician alphabet in order to transact business. The Greeks passed this alphabet to the Romans, and the Romans transmitted it to the German Anglo-Saxon tribes. Then it was brought to the British Isles. The first two letters of the Phoenician and Hebrew alphabet are Aleph and Bet, which is similar to the word alphabet. The black Phoenicians also gave a system of weights and measurements to the Europeans. The city of Carthage was called the Queen of the Sea. The Carthaginians controlled the commerce in the Mediterranean Sea. A new nation emerged in the peninsula of Italy, Rome, which challenged the commercial interest and supremacy of Carthage in the Mediterranean. This state of hostility led to 3 long wars called the Punical Wars. The First Punic War was in the years 264 to 241 BC, mostly naval battles which Italy won. The Second Punic War was fought in the years 218 to 201 BC. A black general by the name of Hannibal was the extraordinary figure who did what was considered the impossible by crossing the Alps with elephants. In Italy, he was victorious over the Romans. He was very resourceful and crafty. When he got into a difficult situation at one time, he drove herds of cattle into the Romans. His unexpected victories amazed and terrified the city of Rome. But at the end, because of lack of men and supplies, he had to return to Africa, Carthage. The Third Punic War was in the years 149 to 146 BC and fought at Zama in Africa. Because of Hannibal's skill in warfare, his strategy is taught in military colleges around the world. The Egyptians. The Egyptians are Africans and descendants of the Hamites. All Hamites are the offspring of their father Ham. The first Egyptian was called Mizraim according to the Hebrews. This Mizraim was the son of Ham, Genesis 10:6. Ancient and modern scholars have established the location of Mizraim as Egypt. The word Mizraim is a plural form meaning Upper and Lower Egypt. About 3,300 years before the Christian era, Egypt was divided into 2 kingdoms. A great black pharaoh, or king, named Menes, united these 2 kingdoms by conquest. The later pharaohs wore a dynastic insignia on their crown, the snake of Lower Egypt and the hawk of Upper Egypt, representing the time when Egypt was divided. The subsequent pharaohs held the title of King of Upper and Lower Egypt. After Egypt was united, her navy went out into the Mediterranean and traded with the inhabitants of the coastal towns and islands such as Crete and Cyprus. Thousands of years ago, the Egyptians established powerful governments and built empires that extended in all directions. They even held dominion over their Canaanite brothers in Palestine for a long period of time. These black Egyptians were so proficient in mathematics, medicine, engineering, and agriculture. They used geometry to resurvey the land every year after the Nile River overflowed. Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician, learned mathematics from the black Egyptians. By the way, algebra came from the black Arabs. The word algebra came from the Arabic word algebra, and it means the science of equations. When the Black Moors conquered Spain and Portugal, they carried algebra into Europe. And Mizraim begat Ludim, and Anamim, and Lehabim, and Naphtuhim, and Pathrusim, and Casluhim, out of whom came Philistim, Philistines, and Caphtorim. When Mizraim begat his children, they dwelled in Egypt, except the Caphtorim and Philistines, which inhabited the Isle of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea. In remote ancient times, the people not only of Asia and Africa were black, but also the people of the southern European lands on the Mediterranean Sea. The black races that controlled the commerce and established colonies on the Mediterranean were the Phoenicians and the Philistines. Herbert Wendt, in his book It Began in Babel, says that Crete was the dominant power during and up to the 2nd century BC. This Cretan power could have been no other than part of the Phoenician Carthaginian Empire, because the city of Cartilage did not fall until the year 146 BC. Where did European civilization and culture begin? Scholars say that it came from Africa and Asia through Crete. Investigators consider Crete to be the birthplace of European culture. There are many myths surrounding the island of Crete. One is, it was to Crete that Zeus, father of the gods, abducted the Phoenician princess Europa, and there fathered 3 sons upon her. Zeus came in the form of a white bull and abducted a black princess because the Phoenicians were a black people. Some scholars believe that before the Indo-European penetration of southern Europe and Asia, Greece was called Europe. Most likely some Cretans settled in Greece. Herbert Wendt says that the name Europe is derived from the Semitic word Arab. It is said that the ancient Asiatics considered the word Arab to be something dark, ignorant, and mysterious, and therefore Europe was the dark part of the earth. A social cataclysm, earthquake, struck the island of Crete and destroyed its capital at Knossos about 2000 BC. These black Philistines migrated from Caphtor, Crete, to the island of Canaan and settled along the southern coast of Palestine. The land of Palestine gets its name from the Philistines who inhabited that region. Chapter 4. The Original Black Jews. Originally, all Hamites and Shemites, or Semites, were black. Abraham was a black Shemite and a descendant of Shem. The name of Abraham was Abram before he was referred to as Abraham. The 3 Hebrew patriarchs were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This Jacob begot 12 sons, who later fathered the 12 tribes of Israel. Abraham was the father not only of the Hebrew Israelite nation, but also of the Arab nation. Now, the mother and grandmother of the Arabian nation were black Hamite Egyptian women, and the fathers of the Arabian nation were Abraham and Ishmael, black Shemites. At a certain time, there were hard feelings between Sarah, Abraham's wife, and Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, so Hagar fled from Abraham's house and dwelt in the wilderness. Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote that Ishmael married an Egyptian woman. As a result, he begat 12 sons, Nebajoth, Kedar, Abdil, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jeter, Napish, and Kemeda. These 12 sons became 12 tribes and inhabited the region from the Euphrates to the Red Sea in the Arabian Peninsula. This country is known today as Arabia. To those who do not believe that the ancient Arabians were black, I would like to make one point crystal clear. If your mother and grandmother were black, I am positive that you would have many colored features. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel were all black people. I shall prove this to you by a gradual method. After Joseph was sold down into Egypt as a slave, we find in the 42nd chapter of Genesis that he has become the viceroy of Egypt. Joseph's 10 brothers came into Egypt in Africa, to buy corn because a famine was in the land. All newcomers who came into Egypt had to buy corn from Joseph, but when Joseph's 10 brothers came to Africa, they did not recognize him. They did not recognize him because Joseph had grown up and the Egyptians were a black people like the sons of Jacob. Jacob's 10 sons considered Joseph to be another black Egyptian. We know this to be true because the 10 brothers returned and reported to their father, "The man who is the Lord of the land spoke roughly to us." Furthermore, if Joseph had been white, he would not have aroused the curiosity of his brothers very rapidly. We really do not need any more proof that the Israelites were black, but for the sake of argument, I will offer it. In many places in the Bible, we find the sons of Jacob and the later Israelites taking black Canaanite women for wives. If the ancient Israelites were not originally black, they would be after the intermingling with black Canaanite men and women. When the king or pharaoh of Egypt promulgated an edict to cast all the Hebrew male babies into the Nile River, Miriam and her mother hid the baby Moses in a basket alongside the river. Meanwhile, Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile to wash herself and she saw the basket and the baby Moses. Pharaoh's daughter knew that the baby was a Hebrew and she adopted him. If Moses had been a white baby, it would have been difficult to conceal him from her father's anger. In the period of Moses, the black Egyptians enslaved black Jews. Another point to prove that the Jews were black is the leprosy laws, written in the 13th chapter of Leviticus and explained in the 2nd chapter of this book. The strangest and most amazing phenomena concerning biblical leprosy is that the skin turned white. These laws of leprosy were given to the nation of Israel and they could not apply to a white nation. Herbert Wendt wrote in his book, "It Began in Babel," all indications point to the fact that Asia was the cradle of the black race. It is written in the book of Daniel 7:9, "I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire." The meaning of this verse is as follows. I beheld till the thrones were cast down. The thrones were placed down and erected. And the Ancient of Days did sit. The God of the universe is the Ancient of Days who sat on the throne. And the hair of his head like pure wool. Daniel saw an anthropomorphic form of God judging the nations in the appearance of a venerable man with woolly hair like a black man. Daniel, the prophet, and the people of his environment, the Babylonians, must have had woolly hair for him to dream of God having woolly hair. Many Israelites in biblical times intermarried with the Canaanite Hamitic tribes, and if the Jews were not black, the Israelites became much darker of a surety after the intermingling. Summary. There is more than enough evidence to prove that all the original Israelites were black, including the surrounding nations in the Middle East. We must consider the evidence that the Dravidians were the original black people of India, that the Cushites, Ethiopians, inhabited the southern Mesopotamian valley, that Abraham and Ishmael married African women, Egyptians, that the Canaanites belonged to the African family of nations, that ancient Israel intermarried with these black Canaanite tribes. At the time that Joseph was the viceroy of Egypt, his brothers could not distinguish him from the black Egyptians because Joseph was black. After Pharaoh promulgated the cruel decree to extirpate the Hebrew males, only a black Moses would have been able to be concealed effectively for any length of time among black Egyptians. That Daniel had a dream of an anthropomorphous god with woolly hair, that biblical leprosy laws of the time could only apply to a very dark people with black hair. The black Jews of India, Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and West Africa consider themselves the original Jews because of the purity of their Israelite blood. This has been stated by Alan H. Godbey. Now we know that Asia was the birthplace of the black race. How did these people in Asia become lighter in complexion? There are 5 answers to this question. 1. The Indo-European invasion or Germanic invasion of Asia. 2. The Greek invasion of the Middle East. 3. The Roman invasion of the Middle East and North Africa. 4. The Jewish slave trade. And 5. The Arab slave trade. The Indo-European invaders penetrated the Middle East and mixed with black Asiatics as far away as India during the 2nd millennium BC. The European Scythians passed through southern Russia and Central Asia as far as the borders of China. During the Greek and Roman invasions, their soldiers settled down in the Middle East and North Africa to disseminate Greek and Roman culture. Moreover, they married colored women. The Jews sold white slaves to the Arabs throughout Africa and Asia. When the Black Moors from North Africa conquered Portugal and Spain, they transported thousands of white slaves of Germanic descent to Africa. All of these white people who came or were brought to Africa and Asia were absorbed into the native population. Black Arabs, Black Jews, and Ethiopians. Arabia, the land of the offspring of Ishmael, the son of Abraham, is bordered on the east by the Indian Ocean, on the northeast by the Persian Gulf, on the north by the Arabian Desert, and on the west by the Red Sea. The most fertile region of this peninsula is the south and southwest. At one point it almost reaches Ethiopia, which is in Africa. There were many Kushite tribes, Ethiopians, living in the northern, western, and southern sections of Arabia. The Arabians have had a long history of intercourse with the Ethiopians in the peninsula of Arabia and with the Ethiopians across the Red Sea in the continent of Africa. James Bruce, author of Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, says that the people in Yemen, Arabia, particularly those of the coast opposite of Saba or Sheba, were reputed Abyssinians, Ethiopians, from the earliest periods till after the Muslim conquest. Many of the Arabs are not black today because of the crossing with white slaves in their households and harems. It is a known fact that there were Ethiopians inhabiting Arabia in the north, southwest, and the southeast. How did these Ethiopians establish domicile, residence, in southwest Arabia? Because Ethiopians lived around the Persian Gulf in northern Arabia, it's highly probable that they migrated toward the southeast and the southwest. It is obvious that the Kushites inhabited vital parts of Arabia before the birth of the progenitors of the Arabs. Rama, the son of Cush, was the father of the Kushite Sheba and Dedan, Genesis 10:7, about 2300 BC. The tribe of Rama became remarkable merchants, Ezekiel 27:22. The descendants of Rama lived in southeast Arabia, and the descendants of Havilah resided in southwest Arabia, which is Yemen. This Havilah was the son of Cush. Moreover, Cush was the patriarch of all the Ethiopian tribes in Babylon, Arabia, India, and on the Nile River. The Kushites were residents of Arabia soon after the confusion of the tongues at Babylon in 2247 BC, but Ishmael, the father of the Arabs, was not born until 1896 BC. My conclusion is that the Ethiopians were in Arabia before the Arabs. In the year 1012 BC, an Ethiopian queen named Bilqis visited King Solomon in Jerusalem. Bilqis came from the kingdom of Sheba in southern Arabia. Sheba was part of the Ethiopian Empire. This empire included Upper Egypt, Ethiopia, and parts of Arabia, which included the kingdom of Sheba. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus calls this queen the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia. Calling this queen the Queen of Ethiopia is proper when you know the historical background and genealogy of the early inhabitants of Arabia. The Queen of Sheba is known also as the Queen of the South. The kingdom of Sheba and Ethiopia was one empire to the south of the land of Israel. We must remember that on the map, Yemen, Arabia almost touches Ethiopia in Africa. It is obvious that the Queen of Sheba had more than one name because she is known to the Ethiopians by the name Makeda. Nevertheless, it is not strange that she had more than one name. The Ethiopian story of Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, is transmitted to us from the Abyssinian archives. This important document is known as the Kibra Nagast, or Honor of the Kings. The Ethiopian account relates the itinerary of the Queen of Ethiopia to meet King Solomon in Jerusalem. She came with a great train, a retinue of officials, servants, and abundant wealth. While she was at Jerusalem, she became infatuated with King Solomon because of the organization of his affairs, his wealth, his wisdom, his understanding, and physical appearance. Moreover, the story relates that King Solomon fathered a child by the Queen of Ethiopia. This child was called David, or Menelik. The queen returned to Sheba, or Saba, with Menelik I. After Menelik had remained in Ethiopia for some years, his mother sent him to King Solomon to be educated. Menelik was crowned king of Ethiopia in Jerusalem, and at that time he accepted the name David. Many experts in the law of Moses, especially one from each tribe, accompanied him to Ethiopia in order to be judges in his kingdom. From the experts, the present Umbares, or supreme judges, 3 of whom always administer to the king, are said to be descended. In the company of this retinue also came Azarias, the son of Zadok, the former high priest, and brought with him a Hebrew transcript of the law. The present Falashas, the Black Jews of Ethiopia, claim descent from those Jews who returned from Jerusalem with Solomon's son Menelik. Moreover, the present emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, claims descent from King Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, and Menelik I. The Queen of Sheba died about 986 BC after reigning 40 years. Menelik I ascended the throne, and his posterity, the documents of Ethiopia say, have reigned ever since. James Bruce, the English explorer, says, "This is no new doctrine. It has been tenaciously and continuously maintained from the earliest records of the period when all Ethiopia was Jewish, then, in later years, after they had embraced Christianity. Furthermore," says James Bruce, "all the adjacent nations agree with the Ethiopian account, whether adversaries or friends, in regard to the Queen of Sheba. They only differ in the name of the Queen." Again, this writer says, "All inhabitants of the coast of Arabia Felix were known as Ethiopians from the most ancient times until after the Islamic conquest. These people were the subjects of the Queen of Ethiopia. They were pagans, then converted to Judaism during the time of the construction of the first temple, and they were Jews from that time to the year 622 AD, as the tradition says, when they became Muslims by the sword of Muhammad." Before the introduction of the three influential religions in Arabia, Judaism, Christianity, and Mohammedanism, the Arabs worshipped the stars, idols, and the Kaaba stone. I shall write about the history of the Jews in Arabia. Then I shall write pertaining to the Christians in Arabia. And last, I shall write concerning the Mohammedans who emerged in the 7th century AD. Thousands of Jews migrated to Egypt and Arabia when the Rome general Titus destroyed the city of Jerusalem in AD 70. When the Jews revolted AD 130, Emperor Hadrian dispatched General Julius Severus to Palestine to suppress the revolt. The persecution and restrictions imposed on the Jews were so great that a large number of Jews fled into Arabia. The tradition of the colored Yemenite Jews of Arabia relates that the first Jews came to Arabia with the prophet Jeremiah just before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple. After considering the Jews of Arabia, we cannot forget the Jews that accompanied the Queen of Sheba and her son Menelik I. It is obvious from many indications that the Queen of Sheba or her son Menelik transferred their capital from Sheba to Ethiopia in Africa, or that they had a second capital at Axum, Ethiopia, on the order of the summer residence. It is not exactly known when the capital was transferred or when Axum came into prominence as a Jewish state, but it probably occurred between the years 990 and 575 BC. At this last date, the Persians conquered Arabia, resulting in the immigration of more Sabians and Habashites or Abyssinians into Ethiopia. Many of the leaders and inhabitants of this Axumite state became Jewish and seized political domination of ancient Ethiopia, called Axum. The Axumite Empire was ruled by Himyaritic immigrants from Arabia, 1st and 2nd centuries AD. According to tradition, the religious center contained the Ark of the Covenant brought from Jerusalem by the offspring of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Basil Davidson said that the Great Period of Ethiopia began soon after AD 50 when Axum became the capital of a new line of kings. It is obvious that these kings were Jews. The success of trade monopoly in ancient times, on both sides of the Red Sea between Africa and Arabia, meant political and military control of key harbors. This is the reason Ethiopia and southern Arabia were included in one empire. There was much commercial rivalry between Saba, Sheba, Himyar, Habesh, and Axum that resulted in many wars. All of the kings and many of the inhabitants of these cities were Jewish at one time or another. Professor Godby says that it is an outstanding point of the tradition going back to Solomon's time for both Abyssinia and Yemen that ancient Hebrew kings on both sides of the Red Sea held the title Bar Nagash, or Sea King. The later Himyarite kings after 250 BC controlled both sides of the Red Sea. When the prosperous Himyarite kings changed the religion, they attached the pretext of religious extremism to the reasons for waging war against their commercial rivals. The kingdoms of Radon and Himyar were united against Habesh, Sheba, and Hadramaut about 500 BC. These rivalries between these alliances brought the Roman fleet into military movement in the Arabian Gulf around 1 BC to capture the port of Aden. When the Roman power declined, there were Jewish kings in Hadramaut, Sheba, and Yemen, continuing the economic rivalries and trade. During the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, Judaism was politically powerful in Arabia. This power was predicated on trade monopoly. There were many Jewish kings: Abu Kariba, Masruk, Du Nuwas, etc. The most notable was Du Nuwas. He will be taken into greater consideration later. The genesis of Christianity in Ethiopia and Arabia. About AD 329, a group of Tyrians, Phoenicians, were embarked for India. Their ship met disaster off the shore of Ethiopia, and the only survivors were the 2 sons of the leader. These boys were captured by the Ethiopians and taken to the court of the king. Frumentius, one of the boys, became instructor to Abra, the prince. Abra later became king of Ethiopia. Frumentius, one of the boys, became instructor to Abraha, the prince. Abraha later became king of Ethiopia. Frumentius taught Christianity to Crown Prince Abraha and others. Frumentius traveled to the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. He had an audience with the temporal head, Constantine the Great, and the extra-celestial head, Saint Athanasius. The leaders of the empire were so tremendously impressed with his abilities that they aided him. Frumentius was promoted to the status of bishop and returned to Ethiopia. The bishop erected and established a church in Ethiopia with the support of the new king, Abraha. By Abraha's confession of Christianity, he became a Judeo-Christian. He was eager for the spread of his new faith into the land of his ancestors and the Arabian Peninsula. Gathering a military expedition of Ethiopians, Abraha crossed the Red Sea with his naval forces and army. He defeated the black Arabs and conquered the pagan city of Mecca after a long siege. After he had introduced Christianity into Arabia, Abraha returned to his capital at Aksum, Ethiopia. By the early part of the 6th century AD, Jewish power in Yemen had reached its zenith. This power was dominant in Yathrib, later called Medina. This was the time of the golden age of the black Jews in Yemen, never to be achieved again. These business tycoons maintained international commerce in a multiplicity of commodities with the East and the West, and the Arab converts to Judaism intermarried with the original Jews. Du Nawas was one of these Arabs who converted to Judaism. He was the king of Yemen about 500 AD. The Jewish sages were invited to teach Judaism to the people at large. When Du Nawas heard that the Jews were being persecuted in the Byzantine Empire, he retaliated by killing some Byzantine merchants and 20,000 Christians in Arabia. This unwise act brought about the fall of the Jewish kingdom. Judaism was not destined to be disseminated in that manner. Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. The Christians, in their terrible hour of despair, made an earnest appeal to the emperor of the Byzantine Empire at Constantinople, but Justinian was hesitant to mobilize a military force because of previous Roman defeats in Arabia. The emperor was advised by the Abuna, patriarch of the Coptic Church in Alexandria, Egypt, to appeal to Saint Elsaban, the emperor of Ethiopia. Saint Elsaban received the envoys and promised to assist the Christians in Yemen. Saint Elsaban organized and mobilized an army of more than 65,000 Africans. He appointed one of his most sagacious generals, Abraha, to be his commander. Abraha transnavigated the Red Sea with 150 ships and a large company of elephants. When the two opposing forces confronted each other, the Jews were defeated and the triumphant Ethiopians marched to Zafar and captured it. The Ethiopians ruled over Arabia at this time with an iron hand. Abraha, the Ethiopian, constructed a marvelous temple at Sana'a in order to attract the pilgrims, pagan Arabs, who passed through this conquered country on their way to the temple at Mecca. Moreover, Abraha devised outlandish and additional inducements in order to entice the Arabs not to go to Mecca. One of the Arabs considered Abraham's actions to be an affront to his religion. As a result, he placed dung on the altar of Abraha's temple. Abraha's reactions were immediate and vigorous to the sacrilege of this pagan Arab. Abraha equipped an army of 41,000 men, horsemen, and armored elephants, and marched to Mecca to destroy the temple. Before Abraha reached Mecca, his army was badly battered by a sandstorm. In addition to this, smallpox broke out in his forces. In spite of these difficulties, the general reached Mecca with adequate forces to intimidate the inhabitants of the city. They capitulated and opened the city gates. When Abraha was riding under the archway of the city gates, his white elephant remained in one spot and would not move. Because of this, rejoicing broke out among the Arabians. Recognizing an act of God, they assailed the Ethiopians violently and transformed the history of the world. Abraha departed from Mecca and died of smallpox and mortification. Because of the obstinacy of Abraha's elephant, the Arabs have called this period the era of the elephant, and only the birth of Muhammad is considered more important. Soon after this event, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born, AD 570. He changed the religion of the entire peninsula of Arabia before he died. The birth of Islam. At the time of the birth of Muhammad, what were the international events or conditions operating? The answer to this question is necessary for a comprehension of the rapid emergence of the Mohammedan Empire. The Roman Empire at the birth of Muhammad was divided into two parts, the Western Empire with the capital at Rome and the Byzantine Empire with the capital at Constantinople. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed AD 476 after many barbarian raids and incursions. The Germanic tribes crossed the border and penetrated into all the territory of the Western Empire, including Africa. The Eastern Empire was deprived of its vigor by repeated wars with Parthia, Persia. This empire could not hold its possessions with a firm grip. Constant imposition of heavy taxes, a scarcity of soldiers and agricultural laborers, economic exhaustion, a large slave class, and influx of the barbarians with frequent wars brought disorder and weakened both the Western and Eastern empires. With the defeat of Jewish and Christian power in Arabia, the stage was now set for the rise of a new power on the world scene. This new power was Arabia. The Arabian Empire, with its new religion, Islam, established the superstructure of its culture from the ruins of the Roman Empire in the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Europe. Europe remained dormant and inactive for 1,000 years through the Dark Ages, while the Moslem Empire mastered the civilized progressive world. Let us return now to survey the rise of the Moslem religion and empire in Arabia. When Muhammad was born, many Arabs were still worshipping the sun, stars, spirits, and idols. The Arabs possessed 360 idols, one for each day of the year. Muhammad was born AD 570, 4 years after the death of Emperor Justinian. He was descended from the tribe of Quraysh and the family of Hashem. His mentality was prodigious. In his youth, he was never taught to read or write, but his imagination was superlative. Muhammad was an extraordinarily handsome man and eloquent in moving men with the power of words. In the early years of Muhammad's life, he passed his time as a shepherd boy. We must remember that many successful men have arisen from insignificant and humble conditions. Watching the sun by day and the stars by night left opportunity for Muhammad to contemplate in solitude and reflect on the events and profundities of this world. After Muhammad became a camel driver, he traveled to remote and intriguing lands. He led his caravans to Persia, Syria, and Egypt, transacting business with merchants of every kind. On his business trips, he met Jews, Christians, and members of other sects. He interrogated them concerning the tenets of their religions. He frequented the environment of the Jews and the rabbis mostly because they were merchants and an omnipresent ethnic group. Because he could not read or write, his ears were attentive and keen to everything that the Jews related to him. Muhammad learned and extracted much from the Jewish religion and compounded it with his new religion, Islam. When Khadijah, a rich widow, heard of the good reputation of Muhammad, she employed him in her business. He went on a business deal, transacted it with good results, and returned home at an advantageous time. Muhammad was amazed at the beauty of Khadijah. He had not seen her before because he had received his position by proxy. Khadijah was immensely gratified by the way he conducted her affairs and the manner in which he presented himself to her. Muhammad was not a tall man, but he had such broad shoulders that he looked like a giant. Muhammad had curly black woolly hair that gave him an excellent appearance. Finally, Muhammad married Khadijah, the rich woman of the city of Mecca, when she was about 40 years old. The first stage of the Islamic Revolution. According to Alvin L. Bertrand, most mass movements pass through 4 stages or phases to complete a whole cycle, but Eric Hoffer, the longshoreman, postulates 3 stages: the vocal stage, the fanatical stage, and the stage of the practical men of action. Muhammad spent many days in the hills outside of Mecca. He was immersed deeply in the deplorable conditions of his people, and he wanted to lead them away from moral turpitude and idolatry. It seemed to him that the angel Gabriel appeared, commissioning him to articulate a new religion to substitute for the old. Incidentally, Gabriel was the same angel who appeared in a vision to the Hebrew prophet Daniel. Muhammad gradually came to believe that he was a prophet and expounded his religion to the members of his family. He went out to the Holy Temple to preach to the multitudes that gathered to worship the idols. With these words, the first phase of the Islamic Revolution began. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. Incidentally, by this time the Hebrew Old Testament had been translated into Arabic, and the Arabs were rapturously pleased to read about their great ancestors in the story of the Hebrew patriarchs. This fact alone helped Muhammad to inspire in the Arabs a feeling of nationalism and racial pride because they had read in the Hebrew scripture that Ishmael was to become a great nation. Muhammad masterminded the first stage of his revolution by undermining and discrediting prevailing established beliefs and customs and questioning other political, social, and religious institutions. Muhammad attacked the merchants and rulers in Mecca who employed the well of Ishmael and Kaaba, temple, for monetary gain. Not only did he speak out against idolatry, but also against gambling and drunkenness. Because he spoke against the wine enterprises in the city of Taif, Muhammad was compelled to leave the city. When Muhammad returned to the city of Mecca, the opposition was intensified against him. A law was enacted that anybody who accepted Islam would be exiled. When the leaders of the city of Mecca were informed that Muhammad was gaining converts in Yathrib, they conspired to assassinate him. This conspiracy motivated Muhammad to flee from Mecca to Yathrib. The night of Muhammad's flight into Yathrib, later called Medina, the city of the Prophet, is known as the Hijra, the flight. The Mohammedan calendar commences with the year of the Hijra. It is the most important event in Islamic history. The Hijra occurred AD 622 when Muhammad was 53 years of age. Coming to Yathrib, Muhammad found the inhabitants very hospitable to him and to his new religion. There were two factors that contributed to this hospitality. One, there were many influential Jews in Yathrib who were allies with the other Arabs. These Jews had introduced the conception of one God. Moreover, the Arabs were somewhat tolerant of the Jews. 2. On a pilgrimage to the temple in Mecca, some of Yathrib's best citizens had been converted by the teachings of Muhammad when he lived in Mecca. Finally, the pilgrims returned to Yathrib and disseminated their new religion. These converts could readily accept Islam because they were influenced to a great extent by the concept of the one God of the Jews. Eventually, Muhammad was proclaimed ruler of the city, and in his honor, the name of Yathrib was changed to Medina. Islam and Judaism. The Prophet Muhammad adopted many principles and laws from the Jewish religion. First of all, the basic idea of monotheism, which is the belief in one God. The Jewish confession of the unity of God is Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Ehad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Mohammedan slogan is as follows. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. Muhammad adopted also the main details of the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement, the Sabbath, much of the Bible, and narratives from the Midrash, and many points of the ritual law. Incidentally, the Jews pray 3 times a day facing the city of Jerusalem, and the Muslims, true believers, pray 5 times a day facing the city of Mecca. Trying his best, Muhammad sought to convert the Jews to his new religion, but to no avail. The Jews were adamant and resistant to change. The high esteem which the Prophet held for the Jews was transformed into enmity, and instead of allies, he looked upon them as competitors. Muhammad needed the confirmation of the influential Jews to validate his mission, as all upstarts need the backing of someone influential. Muhammad, therefore, turned against the Jews and became their tormentor. The 2 daughters of Judaism. The offspring of Judaism are Christianity and Islam. Now history was repeating itself. The proponents of Christianity said to the Jews, "We accept your Bible, morals, and monotheism. Only receive from us Jesus Christ, the great prophet, the Messiah, of whom all the prophets spoke in the scripture." Because the Jews refused, they were despised and hated. Muhammad tried to construct his religion as closely as he could after the Jewish religion. He favored the Jews by accepting many of their laws and traditions. When the Jews refused to be converted, he commanded his followers to stop turning to the holy city of Jerusalem in prayer, but rather turn to the city of Mecca. He changed the Jewish Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement or fast day, which he had accepted for the month of Ramadan. Muhammad changed the Jewish Sabbath from Saturday to Friday. We have another parallel with Christianity. In the 4th century, the church changed the Sabbath to Sunday and reorganized its calendar to make Easter separate of Passover. Like Christianity, also, Muhammad included in his Bible, the Quran, accusations concerning the Jews. Nevertheless, the Quran glorifies many biblical personalities. In order to win the pagans into the church, Christianity adopted many barbaric customs and traditions. Likewise, Muhammad, to gain the loyalty of the pagan Arabs, adopted many of their beloved customs. The Kaaba stone, an idol, was to receive high regard in the new religion. Also, the pagan temple at Mecca was to remain as a holy site. The second stage of the Islamic Revolution. The fanatical stage of most revolutions is a bestial, ruthless, bloody, chaotic affair. The throats of men are cut from ear to ear. There is an absence of rationalization and extreme fanaticism sets in. So it was with Muhammad. He had come to a point of no return. He became a religious extremist in order to give his people a better life on a rapid scale. Muhammad came to the conclusion that all means of persuasion had been exhausted. The period of patience was past and he was now determined to propagate his religion by the sword. For he said, I, last of the prophets, am sent with a sword. The sword is the key to heaven and hell. All who draw it in the name of the faith will be rewarded. Muhammad became a martial prophet, and the pagans and stubborn Jews became his victims. In the year 627, the Battle of the Foss occurred. The Jewish tribes were defeated by the armies of Muhammad. 700 Jews were gathered in the marketplace and offered the alternative, the Quran or the sword, but the devout Jews were accustomed to martyrdom. They did not hesitate in their choice. Muhammad carried out his bestial threat, executed the Jews, and the women were sold. There was another city northeast of Medina called Khaybar. This city was the headquarters of Jewish power in Arabia. After a long siege, the city capitulated to Muhammad. Under the rulership of Omar, the Jews of Khaybar were transplanted to Syria. Muhammad attacked tribe after tribe and caravan after caravan that were going to the city of Mecca. These acts enraged the Meccans, and they equipped a large army to destroy Muhammad. In the ensuing battle, Muhammad was almost killed. Finally, the Prophet marshaled his forces and entered the city of Mecca. The entire city was abandoned because its inhabitants were afraid of Muhammad. Muhammad decimated the idols in Mecca. However, he did not demolish the temple. When the Meccans saw that Muhammad did not destroy their temple, they returned to the city and joined his religion. The third stage of any revolution is marked by the preservation and continuation of the new order. The successor of Muhammad was Abu Bakr. He was called Caliph. Abu Bakr wrote down the speeches and sermons of Muhammad. By this time, Islam held a tenacious grip over the lives of the Arabians. Chapter 5. Black Civilization in Africa.